David Allen Carmichael. I'm going to do a broadcast for Preservative Talk Radio. The theme today is Miracle Monument. I have a special request. I was telling somebody a story about our litigation in, it was 2003, some events, 2008. It culminated in 2006. Earth-shaking litigation where we sued the United States and prevailed on a religious accommodation question. Some of you have heard a little bit about this before. But what I'm going to do today is not talk about the crazy controversy. What I'm going to talk about is the miracles in the midst of it. How does David beat Goliath? Was David just really good at slinging stones? There's the question. I don't, from my own experience, I'm thinking, well, likely David did enough work to make himself, let's say, he can get in the battle so he could swing the thing a little bit and toss that thing in the right direction. But nailing Goliath smack in the middle of the forehead to just knock him out, there's a little statistical probability that we've got to be thinking about. So I was telling somebody the other day about a miracle, something that happened in the middle of the litigation. In fact, I could just go on and on and on and on about the litigation. How do you sue the United States without bazillion dollars, without six figures, to hire a team of lawyers on a case that I had several lawyers tell me was unwinnable? You don't win on military pay cases, and you don't win. This is what one lawyer expressly said. You do not win on military pay cases, and you do not win on Social Security number issues. And this one was no military, you're out of the Navy because you won't identify with a Social Security number. That was the theme. But let me just tell you, and it sounds weird to you. Most people, that's a pretty weird thing. But nonetheless, we had litigation suing the government. And so what I want to do is I want to tell you some miracle stories. And I'm going to tell you the stories, and this is going to be passing down to my posterity, because some of the stuff I told somebody the other day, they said, "You have not told me that story. You need to record that so we can, tell our grandkids about that thing." So that's what I'm going to do, and you're going to eavesdrop today via this media. This is what you're going to do. And it's going to be kind of exciting. You're going to have some time to, in fact, if you want to go to this later, because you're kind of getting the drive-by message right now. But if you want to get it later, you can go to rumble.com, user Preservative Talk Radio, like one word, Preservative Talk Radio. So I'm going to lead up to this, and I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. I'm going to read from a transcript that I have right here from Carmichael versus the United States. And this is back in April 3rd of 2003. And then as I was going through this and I was thinking about the calendar, there was another miracle that related specifically to the timing, to the calendar assignment that I had. And if you don't believe in miracles, you might when we're done. Either way, you're going to hear the story, because whether you think it's a miracle or not, let's just say the circumstantial evidence of divine intervention is here, if you want to talk about this in legal terms. So I was telling my wife about a man. At first I thought not to mention his name, but he was a public figure, sort of. He was the branch head of the Board for Correction of Naval Records back in, I think it was 2000, about 1998, 1999. And his name was Alan Goldsmith. So if you guys know Alan Goldsmith, let him know that I'm talking about him behind his back. And so going to be talking good. So I'm going to tell you the story about Alan Goldsmith, and it's going to lead into this events of litigation. And I hope that I can create a little bit of tension in your hearts and minds. So imagine you got evicted from your military career after 17 years of service, and that you were on your last shore duty before retirement, and you got evicted, not from misbehavior, but from your norm, your conscientious norm, or conscience norm, and administrative bureaucracy preferences. Not a military mission issue, but just you need to do our administrative preferences, and if you don't, oh, you have no loyalty. Well, no, I actually had crazy loyalty, and I had so much loyalty to the military personnel manual, MPIN. What is, no, that's, yeah, military personnel manual. I had such a loyalty to my oath that even regarding myself, I knew my obligation was to uphold the regulations of the Secretary of the Navy. And if somebody below the Secretary of the Navy was doing something that was not consistent with the Secretary of the Navy, then I had a duty to stand contrary to the contrary conduct. And this situation just happened to, I happened to be the person that I had to stand up for. Because there were times in my Navy career, especially as a collateral duty as a command career counselor, that I had to stick my own neck out for the sake of a sailor, because I knew by conscience sake that the detailers were doing somebody wrongly, and I needed to stick my neck out because I worked for my commanding officer, who works essentially for the Secretary of the Navy, if you go up the chain of command. So I had a ministry of serving the commanding officer by making sure that another member of our command was not being shafted by a miscreant detailer. So that's the mindset I had. So here, with that mindset, I went into my own situation with a request for religious accommodation, and that just freaked everybody out. I mean, if you do that, you're already like, it's like people aren't going to look at you and go, oh, hey, this is like a request for liberty or something like that. Well, actually, in the military, you put in a request chit for, that's a CHIT. It means like requesting something, this piece of paper. And your normal reaction you see from people isn't a smile on their face. It's a frown. You're asking for something. You're asking for leave. Well, we're going to, if, I don't care what you think, what you want. It's all automatically a no unless we change our minds. I mean, that's kind of like the military mindset. You got to realize that. But putting in a request for religious accommodation, it's like you're already the enemy, right? We're just going to shoot first and ask questions later, is the kind of situation. But so eventually, I got whisked out of the Navy. On my DD-214, I didn't sign it. They gave me two DD-214s, or they presented one in front of me, and they just had a DD-214. And I looked down and I said, I'm not going to sign that. And he said, why not? I said, because it's wrong. Look at these blocks. I was a career counselor. I knew what the blocks meant, block 25 through 28. What is the discharge authority? It's not the ordinary discharge authority at the end of obligated service. I'm not supposed to be out of the Navy unless you kick me out under the authority of the Secretary of the Navy, and there's an administrative separation board due process that needs to happen first. And if you do that, my request for religious accommodation is going to come up. It's not going to be buried. No, that is not the proper authority. That's block 25 or whatever, right? And then this other block, it said voluntary. No, I'm not voluntarily separating. The order was given. You were there, weren't you, petty officer? I won't tell you his name. Were you there? He said, yes. Did you hear Chief Warrant Officer so-and-so say discharge him? Yes. Is that what you're doing based on that order? Yes. Is that the ordinary administrative separation? No. Okay, so that next block, 26, that's wrong. It's involuntary. And then the other thing was, at the end of obligated service, this is not the end of my obligated service. I have a duty to pay the Navy back 2 years because I just got transferred to this command. And because I just got transferred, the Navy owes me 2 years. I owe them 2 years. This is not the end of my obligated service. What's the last one? Was RE4 enlisted code, which means you can't come back in. But when he did the RE4 enlistment code, they had to have an administrative remarks, page 13, they call it, that said why I was getting an RE4 discharge code instead of RE1E, which is like, re-enlist them now forever. I was in the, must promote category on my last evaluation, but all of a sudden I'm like, you can't stand it. And it had to say why. It says he didn't fulfill his obligated service. So it's the end of obligated service in this block, but because he didn't fulfill his obligated service in the next block, I'm glad you guys recorded that, because if I have to go to court, I love it that your documents actually explain what's happening here. So that was my situation. And then so I wish I had that document here, but there was a document here. I've got it in my office here on one of these books here. But it said when the guy gave me a DD 214 discharge certificate, the first one just said it was just unsigned DD 214, and then the next one he gave me, when I wouldn't sign it, he actually had to type out in the comments why I wasn't going to sign it, and so so what he did is he had this, like I said, the page 13 entry. It says, because he does not agree with the Social Security number on the form. And that's when I said, no, you need to add the other thing I told you. And then he put in there, and you could tell it's on a different typewriter. Back in the day, they used typewriters. And he used typewriters with two different heads. The second typing, you could tell it was done subsequent to his first entry. And it said he does not agree with blocks 25 through 28. So it was in their records that I was challenging the block that said it was voluntary. That was all I needed. You know, the guy was faithful enough to put that in the record. But then, just as they ordered me to be separated, discharged, the officer, chief warrant officer, said, make copies of everything. And that's going to matter, because there was a Mr. Alan Goldsmith, the head of the branch of the Board for Correction of Naval Records, on the phone later, revealed to me that they didn't have my discharge papers. So why didn't they have my discharge? They had all these other things they could reference. They were in letters with me, and they were asking me questions. Well, what about this? What about that? You know, and they're getting the reference right out of the record. And but there was no discharge certificate in the Navy's records, notwithstanding the chief warrant officer ordering. This is what he said: make copies of everything. And it went in that order. He said, discharge him. Make copies of everything. And so he ordered me discharged right after I put my arm down, after saying, I do solemnly swear that I will fulfill my obligated service, blah, blah, blah. I just did it, shoot from the knee, shoot from the hip, confession under oath, because they told me if I put on the form, if I tried to correct the form that I was signing, they said I would be altering the document against Navy regulations, and I'd be in trouble, and it'd be cause for my separation. so I couldn't touch the form. So in front of six witnesses, I raised my hand, gave an oath to fulfill my obligated service. It came up in litigation later as being actually a real thing. It actually had value in law, it turned out, in my case. So he ordered me discharged. He said, make copies of everything. And so what I got to do, so I'm kind of setting you up in the story. You're going to have to come back and stay tuned, because I'm going to tell you what happened when I'm discussing things from the head of the Board for Correction of Naval Records and somebody else. As I was communicating with this bureaucracy, I had miracles happen. And it was affecting people on the other side of the aisle. What was going on was changing the lives and hearts and minds of people in the bureaucracy that we normally think of as, like, if there's a bureaucratic problem, that's the enemy. They're not the enemy. They're ministers of God for our good. So I'm going to come back and tell you some divine intervention that happened in the bureaucracy activities and in the courtroom. Like, subscribe, share. Even if you don't want to, just do it. This is your opportunity to like, subscribe, and share. Because I've got a minute until I come back, and I'm going to read from the transcript of April 3rd, 2003. That's what I'm going to do. Read from the transcript. April 2003. That's what I'm going to do. I think I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Like, subscribe, share. I don't have an algorithm. I mean, I just don't have an audience for an algorithm. I think I've got good stuff, but I need you to share it with people. Fellow Freedom fans, David Allen Carmichael back with an exciting adventure of divine intervention. Today's theme is a monument to miracles, a miracle monument. Today's show is a miracle monument. I'm going to tell you things that really happened, and then you tell me, was it a miracle? We'll see what happens. So in our last exciting segment, I explained that, I got whisked out of the Navy, and what kind of a loser gets whisked out of the Navy? Isn't that like automatically bad? No, it was actually automatically good. It's kind of like, it wasn't quite as good as Jesus going to the cross, but it was like that kind of thing. Sort of like, not as much as like John the Baptist getting his head chopped off, but it was like, it was that sort of thing-esque, where you're doing the right thing and it ends up ticking people off. They're just confused. They don't know what to do with you. So I was in this situation where they whisked me out of the Navy, and then later I prayed, and I prayed and I said, God, you taught me all this stuff about the law, how to obey God and man. You, by your miracle, got me an entire law library at a Navy auction where I found a big giant box that had like over 100 books. And it was about Title 26 tax code and Civil Rights Statute and Title 42 and Title 28 judicial proceedings and American jurisprudence, all these crazy volumes. And God, why would you give me all these things, just have me whisked out of the Navy and not do anything about it? So it was clear to me I needed to sue. Now, I tried to contact lawyers. They told me you can't win a Navy pay case. You can't win an SSN case. Let's shut up and leave us alone. Don't call us. We will not call you, and don't call us. So that's what happened. So I filed suit against the Navy, and I'm losing. And eventually I got a lawyer. I got a man of God. So that's another miracle story, how that all came about. We're going to let that one go. But so as we get into the court and we start suing the Navy and the government and the court rules, it says on the documents here that it's, you're involuntary and they kick me out. But before we get to that miracle, because I've got that, I'm going to set this aside because I'm getting distracted by this transcript from the hearing, oral argument. But I want to tell you about going into this. As I was having to study the law, and I realized that I could sue the Navy in the United States Court of Federal Claims, but I also know that there's this thing about exhausting administrative remedies. I want to make sure I did that. And I thought it, based on the law and case law, that I didn't need to actually apply to the Board for Correction of Naval Records to fix this first. I just, I didn't think they had the authority to actually make the changes I needed. It needed to go to court. But just in case, I gave a phone call to the Board for Correction of Naval Records. And I'm not going to, I think the woman's last name was Bell. But I get on the phone, I'm talking to this lady, and I'm asking her a question about the process, Board for Correction in Naval Records. And I realized, I said, you can't give me legal advice, but I want to see, is there anything that you know particularly that says that this is a requirement, a step of procedure that's necessary? She didn't even answer me a lick about what I talked about. This lady, for 15 minutes, 15 minutes, on the company time, unless she had taken a break, she's on government time, works for the Board of Correction of Naval Records. Maybe I got her name wrong. But she began to do what I've never experienced in my life. And that was what they call prophesying. It was as if she was a messenger from God speaking to me and describing my past, my present, and my future, and she was rebuking me. And she was rebuking me that I was not supposed to second guess what God was doing, but I was supposed to humble myself and accept what his plan was for me. She actually went and talked about his intentions for my children, what God's intentions for my children through what I was experiencing. And she rebuked me in an extremely strong, loving way. And I mean for 15 minutes, because I remember when I got on the phone, I remember when I hung up. I had a 15-minute experience with a prophet. And you say, I don't believe in that junk. I'm just telling you, it's kind of like you show up in the burning bush and go, what's that? What's that? I experienced this amazing thing from a woman who was on the government clock. And you know what I did? I just quit my whining and I just pressed forward. At that point, I'm like, oh man, I have to do what this woman basically chastised me over the phone, over my second guessing God's intention for my life. So I pressed on. I ended up filing suit. Now, as I file suit, that's when I go into the case, and the court basically dismissed me, right? Or was about to dismiss me right away. What they did, instead of dismissing it, they heard that I had filed an appeal in the Board for Correction and Naval Records, so they just remanded the case back to the Board for Correction and Naval Records. It's like, okay, Navy, when you're done processing Mr. Carmichael, if he's still got something to worry about, then we'll revisit the case. In the meantime, the case has stayed. So they sent my case back. That was a legitimate remand. I'd already had my, application in front of the BCNR. They just had done nothing to it. They just ignored my application, just been sitting there. So now I have to talk to Mr. Alan Goldsmith. Now, normally you wouldn't talk to Alan Goldsmith. He's the branch head. He's like the guy that the guys, the official guys, the guys with power, he works for the guys with power. He's kind of like the main guy, the main clerk in charge of all the clerks for the BCNR. So I look back and I say, this guy took it upon himself to have personal interest in my case. And as far as I understand, Mr. Goldsmith is a Orthodox Jew. Okay, he's got a different, let's say, religious bent in life or whatever experience, and so this is going to matter later. His faith in my faith and what was being communicated in the midst of this bureaucracy was quite a wondrous thing, and it culminated in a courtroom later. So as I'm corresponding to Mr. Goldsmith, dear Mr. Carmichael, we're opened your application. Yeah, finally, because the court remanded it. You'd ignored it up to this point. And then, so we've opened this up, and and that's probably why Mr. Goldsmith got it, because it was remanded from a court. It wasn't just left on the desk of some lower clerk, piled up among many other things in their utility bills or whatever. And so Mr. Goldsmith took personal care of this very important case before the Board for Correction Naval Records, BCNR. And so he starts corresponding with me. And so he says, if you have other information besides what you put in your application, you've got 30 days to send it. I didn't have anything. But Mr. Goldsmith calls me at home, and he says, now this is unusual. Hello, Mr. Carmichael, this is Mr. Goldsmith. I'm like, hello, Mr. Goldsmith? Like BCNR Goldsmith? He says, yes, it's me. Mr. Goldsmith, hey, how are you doing? And he says, we're kind of like, we're looking at our documents, and we were wondering, do you have the DD-214? Do I have the DD-214, Mr. Goldsmith? Yes, do you have the DD-214? Could you send us a copy of yours? I said, hey, Mr. Goldsmith, are you? So you're telling me you, the Board for Correction, the Naval Records people, do not have my discharge certificate? And silence. Yes, Mr. Carmichael, we can't find it. And I got real quiet because I realized, do you realize my situation? What I'm complaining about has everything to do with the record. And if they don't have a record that contradicts what I'm saying, which they don't, I mean, I had a good solid record documenting everything that was going on. But they didn't have an alternative record. They didn't have their part of it. And if they don't have the DD-214, it's like prima facie evidence that they're messed up. that their records aren't right. Okay? So I'm in a good position. And I said to Mr. Goldsmith, I said, Mr. Goldsmith, you and I both know the advantage that I have of you not having the discharge certificate. That's like if you've lost every other record in this situation, the discharge certificate is not the one that you want to be missing of all of it, right? Because it had the statement of what I could produce a discharge certificate that says re-enlist immediately, RE1. Obviously, that would be a fraud, but he didn't have it, so he admitted he didn't have the document. So this is what I told him. Now, instead of going, no, I got my stuff together. You got the burden on your part to make sure the court thinks that your act is together. I could have told him no, but I didn't. I said this. I said, Mr. Goldsmith, notwithstanding the advantage that you've given me, I said, because you are a man who's created in the image of God, you have an innate nature of honor, which I, by the word of God, am commanded to honor, because you're created in the image of God. And therefore, because you're a man created in the image of God, and because the Lord Jesus Christ had told me to give to him who asks, because you've asked, I'm going to give you and send you a copy of the DD 214 that I received the day I was discharged. Right? Silence, just a real quiet, mellow, thank you. And then I don't hear from Mr. Goldsmith except in correspondence. And this morning, I went through and I read through all this great correspondence where I'm being like, it's like two professionals communicating in love and peace, but technically correct. And he would tell me some things and I would kind of overdo what he said because I had more information, I had more law. He would say why they didn't need to do something. And so, well, actually, that is generally your directive. But if you look at this law and this regulation, you actually have an obligation under the circumstance to do whatever it is. So I was actually a little bit ahead of Mr. Goldsmith on the details. Looking back and I read the things I read this morning. But here's the thing, is I'm going to come back. Now I need to tell you the miracle that happened later. So eventually the Board for Correction of Naval Records, because the court prompted them to actually open my case and do their job, they set it before a panel. There was a head guy, I can't think of the guy's name, but he was like the head law guy for the Board for Correction of Naval Records. And they made a determination after the fact that the Navy should have turned me down on my request for religious accommodation. That's not the proper procedure. You're not supposed to do that. He should have said, well, you're right. The commanding officer, nobody ever inside the Navy actually process your request, so we need to put you back in the Navy so they can process your request. That's what should have happened legally. But they came up with a determination saying that he should have been denied. The commanding officer should have denied Mr. Carmichael. That's it. Love, BCNR. So they turned me down, and my case went back to the federal court. So now we're going to sue the federal court because the Navy was wrong. The Board for Correction of Naval Records, it turns out if you know the technicalities of administrative law, they let's say, exceeded their authority on what they should have been doing. So that's a claim that we have. And we basically said in our case that the Navy failed to follow its own instructions. And I didn't know about all the instructions when I was getting kicked out, but I knew enough of them to know what they should have been doing correctly. And I began to tell them in writing, while they were doing the wrong thing, what they needed to do that was right. So we're going to come back and I'm going to explain something that happened, a miracle. And I'm going to tell a little bit about my encounter with Mr. Goldsmith in the hearing, because Mr. Goldsmith, little spoiler here, turned out he came to the hearing. After our exchanges, our correspondence, after his part is done, after the Board for Correction of Naval Records does their thing and then sends me a copy of it, or sends me a letter and tells a copy to the court saying, hey, we're done with our thing. We told Mr. Carmichael, too bad, so sad. Well, after that's done, Mr. Goldsmith's job is over. Has nothing to do with my case from that point on. But Mr. Goldsmith came to the hearing and he watched a miracle of the living God. And I'm going to tell you that story that happened in the courtroom. And it was very exciting to see that this little David versus Goliath event isn't just about me. It's about God's plan for us in America. Likely there's a little bit of touch on his intentions for the world. Well, we're going to come back and I'm going to tell you, actually tell the story of something that happened in the courtroom. And I think it's superb circumstantial evidence of divine intervention. Like, subscribe, share. Because this is a radio show. I'm basically using this radio show. I always have a 1-minute break in between 15-minute segments. So I could say things like this. And oh, by the way, I'm going to give you a little spoiler. I'm going to show you a copy. Here's a spoiler. There it is. I got to turn that on. Look at that. Cover my face with this. What is that? It's a 6-figure check to me. From the United States Treasury. $165,020.50. How did that happen? We'll get to that. A few more seconds here. Hello, Freedom fans. David Allen Carmichael, Preservative Talk Radio. Miracle Monument. Today's show is a monument to miracles. And I'm going to tell you something that happened in a courtroom back in, when was that? Was that 2000, I don't know. It was like 2000 and, yeah, it was like 2000. And I was suing the United States, obviously, because they asked me to, no, they ordered me to be they ordered their people to fill out a discharge certificate with my name on it saying I couldn't stay in the Navy after 17 years, Chief Petty Officer. Not allowed to come in because it was the end of my obligated service and I can't come back in because I failed to fulfill my obligated service. How's that for a good discharge paper? So, my previous episode, I told you about this guy, Board for Correction and Naval Records, Mr. Goldsmith, Alan Goldsmith, and he showed up. I'll tell you how I didn't even know he was in the hearing. But so let's say we start suing the United States. The case comes back from the Navy, and we're in an oral argument. And it's the first hearing. And we're sitting there, and I go in with my lawyer, Herb Titus, and he's ready to go. He's founded 2 law schools in his history and done a lot of amazing things, argues for amicus briefs to the U.S. Supreme Court all the time. He's kind of like a top-notch guy. I can't afford to hire this guy. But because of a miracle, I've hired the guy. And he's allowed to be hired by me. And he doesn't, there's only so many people you can get Herb Titus to work for. So he's working for little David while we take on Goliath. And we're in oral argument. And one of the things I do is I'm his clerk. So Herb, to keep my costs down, he made me be the paralegal. So I'm sitting there next to him at the desk in the hearing, and I got my legal pad, and I'm going to write down all the things that the government says that we need to counter. So Herb gets up and he tells his speech, but he's only got 12 minutes. And so he leaves a whole bunch of stuff out. He hits some real specific technical things without wasting time basically telling the story that we wish the court would hear. Just don't have time for that. So we got to technical details just to get right to the crux of the procedural issues that we need to touch on. And so he sits down and I'm ready to write what the government lawyer is going to say. And anything that she says that's bogus, I'm going to write it down on a list so when he has rebuttal time, he doesn't waive the argument. He's got to actually look at what she said, a list, and make sure in the last 2 minutes that he has that he's reserved, that he mentions that he discounts what she just said. So I'm standing there waiting for her to say stupid things. And so I'm sitting there waiting, and she begins to speak. She used about 8 minutes of her 12 minutes of time, or whatever it was, she had 15 minutes of time. Let's just say at least maybe about 2/3 of the time, she spent telling our case, actually saying what we wish we had time to say. She began to say, well, Mr. Carmichael, a deeply devout Christian man, had these religious convictions, and that he could not continue to identify with the Navy military personnel identification number because of the sincere convictions of religion, and that he made a religious accommodation request, and it was supposed to go through the commanding officer. The regulations require it to go to the commanding officer. And she continued to just kind of explain what we wish we had time to go into detail. We just avoided that stuff. We just don't have enough time to just tell the good stuff about, tell the cause that we're dealing with. But she just went ahead and as I was sitting there and I'm thinking, and I'm waiting for her to say something that we disagree with, and she's not, in fact, I realize she's actually arguing our case for us. This is weird. I've read all her briefs so far. All the things she's never said anything that, for us. So, and then I realized, oh my goodness, there's a miracle happening right now. And I kind of put down I was kind of like in fear and awe, like burning bush moment, take your sandals off. I put my pen down, like, hey, this is a miracle. I'm going to trust God here. I'm going to deliberately put my pen down and just go for the ride. In fact, as I did it, and she just continued to go on and go deeper and deeper, singing our song, and I started leaning back in the chair. There's got this big chairs, and if you start leaning back, it gets to a certain place, and it like really lays back. Like you got to fight it to get back up. And I went and laid way back in this thing, and I'm kind of swiveling, and she's just telling our cause. And she finishes, she kind of came to a pause, and the judge says, so you mean, and he starts to describe our case. He had this conviction, all this kind of stuff. The religious accommodation instruction was not followed. It never went to the commanding officer, and because of that, and the process was not followed, and then so Mr. Carmichael was discharged from the Navy against the regulations. Essentially, it was an unlawful discharge, and that he's got a cause for action. And she says, no, I'm not saying that. And he says, well, you just said that. She said, well, I didn't mean to. And then she only had a few minutes left to try to come up with, get her wits about her and say what was necessary. So I'm sitting there in the middle of the courtroom. This is a Miracle Monument show today. And I'm sitting there in the courtroom, and I'm like, wow. This is a miracle. Okay, so the hearing ends, and we finish. We get up, and there were 3 people sitting in the audience area. One of them was my friend Sam. He came with us because he took the day off so he could watch. He's never been in a situation seeing a case like this. He realized this is pretty significant. So he's going to go for the ride. So he went up with myself and Herb Titus, and so he was sitting there. And then it turned out there was a guy named Chris, because as we walked to go out and meet Sam, there was a guy, Chris, there. Chris was one of Herb's students at Regent University, either Regent or Roberts. I don't know what it was. I think it was Regent. But he, Herb had an influence in his life. He was working in the courthouse. He saw Herb's name on the docket, and he scurried on upstairs to see what was going on with Herb Titus arguing this case. And so both of those guys, as we're sitting there talking to him, we're still in the courtroom. We're just, where the audience area is, and we're discussing it. And Sam says, "I didn't know what to do. I realized this was high stress. This is the kind of the big leagues here, and I didn't know. I felt like I needed to do something besides just watch." And he began to pray, and he said, "And God spoke to me and said, pray that the enemy is confused." So he did. He said, I just started praying, God, would you just confuse the government? Would you just confuse their minds? Would you just work on behalf of David in this cause? And so he's just praying that. So then Sam says he's finishing, and the guy Chris, Herb's former student, said the same thing happened to me. I was sitting there, and all of a sudden I get this like a voice from God saying, pray that the enemy is confused. And so he just starts praying that, Lord, will you confuse the enemy? And so these two guys are having this, they don't know each other. They didn't know that, they didn't know each other's background. They're just sitting there. And there's a third man standing there. I don't know this guy from anybody. He's kind of smiling, kind of grinning. He's a guy in maybe his late 40s or whatever. And he's kind of like he's entering in on the group, but I don't know who the guy is. But so Chris finishes his testimony of hearing from God to pray to confuse the enemy. And then we're just rehearsing over, did well, look what Miss, Springer Moore said here, the U.S. attorney. Look what she said. Look what she did. And we're just kind of having it. We're kind of laugh crying, And then I look over and I see this guy kind of looking in, smiling, like he's about 6 feet away, but 6 or 7 feet away. But he's like he wants to enter in as part of the conversation. I stop. I said, "Hello, sir." I said, "Are you here to listen to this? Do you know Herb from anywhere?" He said, "No, I've never met him." I said, "Well, who are you? What's your interest?" He says, "I'm Mr. Goldsmith." He is the head of the branch of whatever, the Board for Correction of Naval Records. He's the guy. He's the head guy. He's like the chief clerk of the Board for Correction of Naval Records. He has these little clerkettes that work for him that manage all the Board for Correction of Naval Records applications and processing and all that kind of stuff. He's the head guy. I said, "Mr. Goldsmith, I would think that you weren't supposed to be here," because he's the enemy. You see, he's part of the agency that has done me wrong. And he said, "I'm not supposed to be here." I said, "Well, why are you here?" He said, "I had to meet you." "You had to meet me?" He says, "I've never met anybody like you. I needed to meet you." So here's the Jewish man hearing our Christian nuts talking about praying, "God, what do I do?" Hearing from God. These two guys just gave testimony in this courtroom without being sworn in. And here's this Jewish man worked for the bureaucracy that was the giant, right? And he's listening to this and he's tuning in and he's smiling and he's eating it up. But you could tell that wasn't the norm for him. This was a new experience for him. And because of my opportunity to interact with him in writing, to have official correspondence where he was having me argue over regulations in a loving way and a gracious way, and giving the testimony of my faith and the contradiction of the Navy regulations and the Navy behavior contrasted to my behavior and my obligations, and showing Mr. Goldsmith in writing that the government and its actors had blown it and needed to be corrected, and I needed to be reinstated. And then again that day that he called me and said, "Mr. Carmichael, you don't like have your copy of the DD-214 discharge paper, do you? Well, do you think we could have a copy of your copy?" And when I realized they didn't have the discharge paper and I'm suing them over an unlawful discharge, that is really, really in my favor. But nonetheless, again, I conveyed to Mr. Goldsmith, I was going to send him a copy of it because Jesus told us to give to him who asks. Was able to give a testimony to Mr. Goldsmith. It affected his life, affected his soul. Like moth to a flame, Mr. Goldsmith came to a hearing about which and of which he had no official interest whatsoever. In fact, I would think his presence in what would seem on its face to be collaborating with me or, visiting and celebrating the miracle with us of two guys getting a word as they're watching this argument to pray that the enemy gets confused, and then the U.S. attorney spending the majority of her time opening her oral argument, saying the things that we wish we had time to say, for our sake. He watched a miracle. He heard the miracle. And again, Mr. Goldsmith knew the details of my case. And when the government lawyer is saying the details of my case in my favor, she's kind of quoting the kinds of things that I had sent to Mr. Goldsmith in my letters to the Board for Correction of Naval Records, communicating to him directly the kinds of things that she spent all of her time in the courtroom telling the judge. And then he said, well, then she ended up closing with, I didn't mean to say that. And the judge says, well, you just said that. But I didn't mean to. So today is a miracle monument. I'm going to have another segment of talking about this, because this was one instance where we saw the miracle in the courtroom. And I'll take an opportunity to give another segment, let's say, where I talk about some other things that happened later on that were clearly, again, confusing the enemy, so to speak, where those who were against me couldn't help themselves but to speak on my behalf. Here's what the Bible said. The wicked plots against the just and gnashes at him with his teeth. The Lord laughs at him, for he sees that his day is coming. David Allen Carmichael, Preservative Talk Radio, Nougat Radio, loving every minute of it. All right, that's the end of my radio show, and it's 3 segments, so I'm going to close the video off tonight. If you want to look at the case, it's Carmichael versus United States, 298 F. 3rd, page 1367 in the Federal Circuit. Was a very important ruling in the Court of Appeals. And then 66 Federal Claims, page 115, is the judgment at the end of this whole thing. Crazy. This is the unwinnable case that was won. So it would definitely behoove you to check it out. And if you have any questions, send me something. You know, you can send some comments on the Rumble. Go to rumble.com and then /user/preservative talk radio, one word, lowercase. And that's it. So David versus Goliath, thank you for being a part of this basically miracle monument radio show. And we're going to have another.